Okay, are we on? Are we on? Okay. The topic I was asked to speak on is the final restoration of Israel, and in your bulletin you should have a one-page outline like this, double-sided. You might use it to follow the message of the study. Let me discuss the basis for the belief in a final restoration of Israel. Now, in the first 4 centuries, from all of the church writings that have existed, what is clear, the church was pretty well what we call premillennial, meaning the Messiah will come and set up the Messianic kingdom. What they were not clear on is the role of Israel in the Messianic kingdom. Largely, Israel was ignored except for a few statements here and there, but they saw it mostly as a good time for the rule of the church in the kingdom. Then things began to change in the 4th century through 2 individuals. The first one was Origen, who introduced the allegorical method of interpreting the Bible. What was important for him is not the obvious meaning of the text, but something deeper, hidden spiritual meaning. He applied to the whole Bible, including the historical segments of the Bible. But then came Augustine, who took those principles and applied them more specifically to Bible prophecy and the prophecies about Israel in the kingdom. He introduced a new system of prophecy, which is still the dominant position in the visible church, and that is amillennialism, meaning no millennium, no literal millennium on this earth. Rather, he said the millennium, the 1,000 years, is simply a symbolic number between the first and second coming. So we are already in the millennium, and this is already the kingdom. Now, coming from my Jewish perspective, I would have to say, if this is the millennium, we must be living in the slum section of the millennium. It's not as nice as the Bible describes it. And that became, and he influenced, by the time the 4th century ended, the church was primarily a millennium, no future kingdom, and therefore no restoration of the Jewish people to land of Israel. And he says the whole basis for believing in the Messianic kingdom is Revelation 20, which is in a highly symbolic book, and it's foolish to base a large doctrine like the kingdom on one chapter of one symbolic book. That's the accusation, but it's not really a valid accusation. For example, in Judaism, in the Orthodox segment of Judaism, there was always a belief in the Messianic kingdom. They didn't know how long it would be, so therefore they did not call it the millennium, they called it the Messianic kingdom, which would come after Messiah comes. And Revelation is not in the Jewish Bible. So where they get that from? And we'll see that as we move to the study. But the basis for belief in the Messianic kingdom is based not on Revelation 20, it's based upon 2 other things. First of all, the unfulfilled promises of the Jewish covenants. And on the screen notice, he made 4 eternal unconditional covenants with the Jewish people. The Abrahamic covenant that promised the land and the seed. The land covenant that promised after a worldwide dispersion, there'll also be a worldwide regathering of the Jewish people back into land. And all theologies agree that the dispersion was very literally fulfilled. When you get to the regathering section of this covenant, they begin to allegorize it as referring to the elect being brought into the church, but Moses never changed his audience in the presentation of this covenant. You have the Davidic covenant that promised a royal house, a king and throne, and it promised the Messiah would rule from Jerusalem, from the throne of David, over a restored Israel and a saved Israel. Now, in the replacement theology, they allegorize it as, well, he's sitting now in heaven, and that fulfills the Davidic covenant. No, it doesn't. Until he sits upon the throne of David, and ruling from Jerusalem, not from heaven, and ruling over a saved Israel, the covenant remains still unfulfilled. And fourthly, there is the new covenant that promised a new heart, a new spirit, and forgiveness of sin, but also points out it will be applied to a whole generation of Israel. A whole generation will someday come when every Jew living at that point of time will come to faith. And for these promises to be fulfilled requires a future Messianic kingdom. Next. Now, from these four covenants, we can derive there are four facets to Israel's final restoration. As we go through these four facets, we're going to also give examples of prophetic development. And so the first facet is the regeneration of Israel, a national salvation based upon the new covenant. Secondly, the regathering of Israel based upon the land covenant. Thirdly, the restoration, the possession of the land based upon the Abrahamic covenant. And fourthly, the reestablishment of the Davidic throne based upon the Davidic covenant. And so these are the four facets of Israel's final restoration. And how we'll develop our teaching this morning is we'll first of all look at the covenantal basis for each of these four facets and give only some examples of prophetic development. The examples we shall be showing is only a sample. These are not all of what the prophets teach. We don't have enough, a couple of weeks yet, to do this in this session. We're going to be only giving a sampling of what the prophets did say. Now the question is, why is this belief in the final restoration of Israel so essential? Why is it necessary? Why don't we just simply drop this and avoid this division in the church? Well, if you drop this, you might that won't stop the division of the church. There are over 1,000 denominations around the world today, and they divide over many issues. So this is not the only issue it divides itself off. But no matter what the issues are, the key issue is always going to be, what does the Bible teach, taking it normally as you read it? What does it teach? And that's why this is important. And we cannot trust God to fulfill his promises to Israel. How can we know he'll fulfill his promises to us someday? So these are the things we have to keep in mind. So let me point out four reasons why this is important. First of all, to vindicate the promises of God. I won't be looking up these scriptures because my time is rather limited this morning. But Numbers 23 verse 19 says, unlike people, God does not make a promise that he will not fail to keep. People make promises, sometimes they keep it, sometimes they don't deliberately, sometimes they don't because they find themselves unable to keep the promise. God is not like that. Every promise God makes is fulfilled eventually in the short term or long term. But not only is it fulfilled, it's fulfilled to the one to whom the promise was made. Fulfilled to whom the promise was made. And so if you ever say two children and you promise your oldest child a bicycle, but then the oldest child offends you for some reason, you go ahead and buy the bicycle as you promised, but you give it to your second child. Have you really fulfilled your promise? No. Whatever else you want to do for the second child, until you buy a bicycle for the first child to whom the promise was made, the promise remains unfulfilled. So whatever promises God made for the body of the Messiah, that's not in place of the promises he made to Israel. And we cannot trust the promises he made to Israel to be fulfilled. We cannot trust God to fulfill the promises to us who are the body of the Messiah. Isaiah 34 verse 16 points out every prophecy that's not yet fulfilled is like an individual person who has not yet found his or her mate. So eventually, every prophecy must find his or her mate. Every prophecy will have to be fulfilled. Every promise must be fulfilled to whom the promise was made. Now, secondly, a restoration is predicted from which there will never again be another exile, another dispersion. Because what some people do in replacement theology is claim all of the restoration prophecies have been fulfilled once the people returned from Babylonian captivity, and that fulfilled all the unfulfilled promises. However, some promises don't merely talk about Israel's restoration, they specify Israel will never again be forced out of the land through an exile or through a dispersion. For example, Jeremiah 24 verse 6, he says, I will plant them in the land, they shall never again be uprooted in the land. The same point is made in Joel chapter 3 verse 20, Joel 3:20, Amos 9 verses 14 and 15, never again to be uprooted from the land. Now the third reason why this is important is the promised land has never been possessed in all of its promised length and breadth. The promised land is still a land of promise, not yet fulfilled. And in ancient history, the Jews have never possessed all of the promised land, nor do we possess it at the present time either. What you see in biblical history and modern history is this principle of more or less, more or less. For example, under Joshua, they had more. In the book of Judges, less. And then in David and Solomon, a lot more, but not all of it. And like Lebanon, for example, was always part of the promised land. And Israel never had that promised land, even under David and Solomon. And then it was the split of the kingdom less again. And the more or less continued until they went into, of Israel, the Assyrian captivity, and Judah, the Babylonian captivity. At the modern history, we've seen the same thing. In 1948, less. 1967, more. And with negotiations in recent times, less again. The principle of more or less will continue until Israel becomes a believing people. Only then will they possess all the promised land, settle in all the promised land, and live in peace in the promised land. And this has not been true in biblical history, and also true in modern history. And therefore, for the promise of the borders of the land to be fulfilled, it requires the future restoration of Israel in the Messianic kingdom. And then you have the Messiah who has not yet exercised his third role, the role of king. We talk about the three offices of the Messiah. He is a prophet, he is a priest, he is a king. While he has these three offices, he does not function in these three offices simultaneously, but in chronological sequence. Now, so during his first coming, he functioned in the office of a prophet who receives direct revelation from God. He does two things with it. He tells God's will for his own generation, but secondly, a prophet predicts future events both near and far. And Yeshua was a prophet receiving direct revelation from God the Father. He proclaimed God's will for his own generation, as he does in Matthew 5-7. Matthew 5-7. He also predicts future events both near and far, as in Matthew 24 and 25. Matthew 24 and 25. With his ascension, he underwent the transition from the office of a prophet to the office of a priest. He is our priest in heaven, ever making intercession for us. He also called in that role an advocate, an older word for lawyer. So when Satan has any grounds of accusing us, the Messiah can say, lay that sin upon my account. I've already paid for that sin when I died for that one on the cross. Here's a basic spiritual truth most believers are not aware of. If you're a believer, you have a Jewish lawyer sitting at the right hand of God the Father. He's never lost a case yet. And that's why his salvation is so eternally secure. He was a prophet, he's a priest. He had never yet functioned as a king, specifically the king of Israel, and more in general, the king of the world. And for that to occur, there must be a future restoration of Israel and a future Messianic kingdom. So these are just four many other reasons that we can give for why a belief in this is necessary. Let's go on now to four facets of the final restoration of Israel. We begin with the regeneration of Israel, which is based upon the new covenant. In Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. In verse 31, he announces he's making a new covenant. This is still future in Jeremiah's day. I will make a new covenant with both houses of Israel. That statement tells you the new covenant is a Jewish covenant. It's not a Gentile covenant. It's not a church covenant. It's specifically made with the people of Israel. And in verse 32 is going to be in contrast to the Mosaic covenant, which contained the 613 of the laws of the Torah, the Mosaic covenant, which was already broken, as he points out in this verse in Jeremiah's day. But the new covenant will be in place of the Mosaic covenant. And in verse 33, it will result in inward power, enabling Jewish people to keep the righteous standards of God. And finally, verse 34 will result in the national salvation of Israel. And it points out how all-inclusive. So he says it will not be necessary for one Jew to tell another Jew, know the Lord, they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. will apply to all the Jewish people living at that point of time. It does not mean, as some people teach, that will include all Jews of all time. That's not the teaching. Otherwise, often they would say there's no need to worry about Jewish evangelism. All Jews will be saved eventually. That's not what the text teaches. It's not Jews of all time, but Jews of a certain point of time. And that's when we'll still continue witnessing to the Jewish people. Otherwise, if they die without believing, they're just as lost as any Gentile would be lost. So that's the basis of the first facet, the New Covenant. Let's look at examples of some prophetic development. Isaiah 29, verse 22 to 24, Israel's national regeneration will make Jacob proud. Isaiah 30, verses 18 to 22, the judgments of the Great Tribulation will be used to bring Israel to salvation. Isaiah 44, verses 1 through 5, God shows Israel from the beginning, and therefore intends to pour out the Holy Spirit upon them. There are 5 passages in Scripture of an outpouring upon the Spirit upon the whole nation. They'll bring them all to faith. There's just one example. And Israel therefore begin to bear fruit. Israel's loyalty to God will remain total. Israel's had regenerations before, as we saw in the book of Judges. However, once the judge dies, they fall back into idolatry. But this time, they never fall back into living in sin again. Next. Isaiah 44, 21 to 23 emphasizes the removal of Israel's sins. Isaiah 45, 17 promises everlasting salvation and freedom from shame. Jeremiah 24, 7, a new undivided heart to know the Lord. Jeremiah 50, verses 19 and 20, Israel's sins will no longer be found. Next. Ezekiel 11, verses 19 to 20, he promises them a new heart, a new human spirit, enabling them to walk in the law of the Lord. Next. In Ezekiel 36, he repeats those 2 new things in verses 25 to 27, a new human heart, a new human spirit. But in verse 27, he points out, he also added a 3rd element, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And the indwelling of the Holy Spirit working with the newborn human spirit will give them the divine enablement to keep the righteous standards of God. Next, Hosea 1:10 to chapter 2, verse 1, Israel's population will be increased. He pointed out, while Israel is always the people of God, they do not experience the being the people of God when they live in sin. Hosea prophesied, therefore for a period of time they will be lo ami, not my people. When they come to a national salvation, they'll again be ami, my people. And therefore they will obtain God's mercy. So again, they're always covenantally the people of God, the chosen people. But they don't experience the benefits of being the chosen people when they live in sin. But in this case, they'll be both the people of God covenantally and experientially. Next. Next.
This is the next one.
Huh?
This is the next
Oh, very good. Okay, Israel's backslidings, this is Isaiah 14:48. Israel's backslidings will be healed. They will see manifold blessings of God. The worship of other gods will cease once and for all. Next. Joel 2, verses 28 to 32, also another prophecy. There'll be an outpouring of the Holy Spirit upon all flesh, but in the context of that passage, all Jewish flesh. And so all of the whole remnant of Israel will come to salvation. And they'll all call upon the name of the Lord, and God's response is to deliver them and saving them. Micah 7, verses 18 to 20, God will forgive their sins on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant. It also says God will cast their sins out into the depths of the sea. That's the origin of the Jewish service called the Tashlich, the casting forth. At the time of the Rosh Hashanah, Feast of Trumpets, after service, Jewish people go to some body of water, or the Orthodox they go. Could be any water, a stream, a beach, a lake, whatever, and symbolically cast their sins into the sea. If you ask them, did God forgive your sins, the best answer you'll get, I hope so. They have no assurance of it. But this ritual won't save them, and this ritual won't take away their sins. It's when they believe that Yeshua is the one who died for their sins that will take those sins away. Next. Zephaniah 3, verses 9 through 13, the regeneration, no matter where the Jews live anywhere around the world, they will all come to faith at the same point of time. Next. Romans 11. He starts out in verse 25 concerning something they need to know. You don't have to be a believer very long to realize how fragmented the body of the Messiah has become. As I mentioned, there's more than 1,000 denominations around the world. The biggest Protestant group in America is probably the Baptist Church, but they have more than one denomination. To give you a short list, there's the Southern Baptist, American Baptist, there's the Conservative Baptist, General Association of Regular Baptists, the General Baptist Conference. There is the there is what do you call them? The Arminian Baptist, the Free Will Baptist. There's also the Calvinist Baptist. The same thing has happened with the Brethren Church. There's more than one Brethren group we have here. You have the Plymouth Brethren, the Grace Brethren, the Mennonite Brethren, the Open Brethren, the Closed Brethren. There's nothing wrong with being a member of any of these Brethren congregations, but there's one Brethren denomination the Bible forbids us to join. It's the one he mentions here in verse 25 where it says, I would not have you ignorant brethren. So never join any congregation called the Church of the Ignorant Brethren. It's forbidden right here. What he does want them to be ignorant about is two things. Number one, Israel's hardening is partial, and because it's partial, there will always be Jews coming to faith. And that's the point in Romans 11, verses 1 through 10. And that's why there are Messianic Jews in this congregation. But secondly, the hardening is temporary until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And the Greek word for fullness means a set number. God has a set number of Gentiles he'll bring into the body. Once the set number is reached, that's the program for the body is complete, then God will work with Israel until all Israel is saved. And that's and then he goes on to prove it in verses 26 and 27. He quotes the New Covenant as his evidence. That was following the fullness of the Gentiles, there'll be a national salvation of Israel. Okay, let's go on to the next facet. The regathering of Israel based upon the land covenant. If you don't mind, just turn to this one just so we clarify a couple of things. Deuteronomy chapter 29, the book of Deuteronomy chapter 29. Chapters 29 and 30 is what covers this covenant. Now, notice that's in the 5th book of Moses, so why would not this be, if some asked, just being part of the Mosaic covenant? We distinguish it because he tells us to in verse 1. These are the words of the covenant, which Yahweh commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab. Notice, besides the covenant he made with them in Horeb. Horeb is a mountain range where Mount Sinai is located, and that's where the Mosaic covenant was made. He points out this is a distinctive covenant. And what he points out in the rest of this chapter is in verses 2 to 9, a historical summary of the wilderness wanderings. In verses 10 through 13, therefore another covenant now needs to be made. In verses 14 to 21, he warns them against turning away from the Lord. However, in verses 22 to 29, they'll finally go into sin and suffer worldwide dispersion. That comes as a direct result of rejecting the one that came like unto Moses that Moses spoke about in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 18. So you notice that everything it says in chapter 29 has been literally fulfilled. There's still more Jews outside the land than inside the land. There was a common saying in the previous generation, in fulfillment of prophecy, that you'll find the Jews in all 7 continents except for the continent of the Antarctica. One of the founders of CPM was living in those days, and he one day said, that's not true. You'll find the Jews even in the Antarctica because everyone has heard about the icebergs. But now in chapter 30, still speaking to the people of Israel, still speaking to the Jewish people, he points out the people that God dispersed around the world, he'll regather them. So in verses 1 and 2, there'll be an ultimate regathering of Israel. Verse 3, the regathering will come from all over the world. In verse 4, the Jews from all over the world will return. from the four corners of the earth and the four corners of heaven. In verse 5, they'll be brought into the promised land. And that occurs again in verse 6, only after Israel's national regeneration. And then in verse 7, the punishments will be applied to the Gentiles. In verse 8 and 9, the curses will fall on the Gentiles, but blessings upon Israel. And in verse 10, there'll be a total return to the Lord spiritually, not merely physically. And in verses 11 through 20, he gives some further admonitions and warnings and promises. So the belief in a final restoration of Israel is based upon the land covenant of these two chapters in the 5th book of Moses. Now next. Now for some prophetic development, he points out that this final worldwide restoration will be the second worldwide regathering. The Bible speaks of two different worldwide regatherings. First of all, a worldwide regathering in unbelief, in preparation for judgment to bring them to national salvation. And that's the regathering we'll see with the modern Jewish state of Israel. And some passages that speak about a regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment include Ezekiel 20, verses 33 to 38, Ezekiel 20, 33 to 38, chapter 22, verses 17 to 22, chapter 22, verses 17 to 22, and also Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 1 and 2. Zephaniah 2, verse 1 and 2. And those are the prophecies the modern Jewish state is now fulfilling. But these prophecies talk about a regathering which when they come back in faith in preparation for blessing, the blessings of the kingdom. And he refers to that as the second worldwide regathering. The first one could not be the return from Babylon. That was not a regathering from the four corners of the earth. That was a migration from one country, Babylonia, back to another, Judea. But now he promises there'll be a second worldwide regathering in faith in preparation for blessings. And they'll be regathered from all over the world. In verses 13 and 14, unity between Israel and Judah will be restored. That when they come back, the tendency of Jewish people like to argue all the time will cease. It's a major attribute that will finally cease. Most of you heard of the riddle, not the riddle, but the Jewish saying, we have two Jews to get, there are three different opinions. Well, there's also not the story of two rabbis in the middle of winter in New York, on the streets of New York City. And Jewish people like to argue with their hands. And so one rabbi is arguing, moving back and forth, arguing. He finally says, Sam, you argue for a while, my hands are cold. And this regathering would be accompanied by the same types of miracles as happened in the 40 years of wilderness wanderings. And the result in verse chapter 12 are two songs of praise. Isaiah 27, verses 12 and 13. Verse 12 describes the totality of the final regathering. One by one, every Jew will be brought back to the promised land. And furthermore, in verse 13, it will be signaled by the sound of a great trumpet. With the sound of a great trumpet, the Jews will be finally brought back. It will be the sound with the great shofar. The way shofar got its name is in the story of Joshua when he walked around Jericho 7 times and the walls fell. He was heard to say, shofar, show good. And that's how the name got its name. Isaiah 43, verses 5 to 7. In verse 5 and 6, the regathering is worldwide. But in verse 7, he provides the magnitude because he uses 3 words, created, formed, and made. The previous time that you'll see these 3 words used, created, formed, and made, is the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Certain things God created, certain things he formed, certain things he made. Emphasizing these are things only God can do. And the Hebrew word for create, bara, B-A-R-A, in classical Hebrew is only used as something God can do, not of any human being being able to do. And so, as he points out, what's going to happen with this final restoration is something only God could accomplish. And not something any human being or movement could accomplish. Next. Jeremiah 16, verses 14 and 15 use a different historical perspective. Jeremiah points out that the leaders of Israel often say, as the Lord lives who brought us out of the land of Egypt. That will change. Historically, the high point of Jewish history is the Exodus, but that will change. He points out in the future that will say, as the Lord lives, who brought us from all the countries whither he has driven us. And the final restoration and regathering will be the new high point of Jewish history. Next. Jeremiah 23, verses 3 and 4, they are going to be regathered to produce fruit, and will finally have righteous leaders that will never again lead them astray. Next. Jeremiah 31, 7 through 10, they'll undergo regeneration, regathering, regardless of their health or location. There'll be no hindrances to the regathering, and God will be the one doing it. Ezekiel 11, verses 14 through 18, the people that God scattered, the Jewish people, will be the people he also regather. You cannot take the first half literally and then symbolize the second half. Israel was scattered by God, Israel will be regathered by God. And the regeneration will also cleanse the land. Next. Ezekiel 36:24, a regathering to the land. Next. Amos 9, 14 and 15 emphasizes permanency. That's the prophecy to never be uprooted from the land ever again. Next. Zephaniah 3, verses 18 through 20, the judgment God will inflict Israel was not for the purpose of just to punish them, but for the purpose of correcting them. And it will work. Israel will be regathered and become a name and a praise among all the nations. Zechariah 10, verses 8 through 12, like a shepherd when he gives a specific call, and the sheep know the shepherd's voice and gather to him, by the same token there'll be the call of the shepherd that will begin the regathering following the regeneration, especially regathering from the Middle East nations, and the promises they'll never depart from the Lord again. Matthew 24:31 is built upon Isaiah 27, verses 12 and 13, about Israel's final regathering with the sound of a great trumpet. That's the same point this passage teaches. The final regathering will be with the sound of a great trumpet, and God will use angels to bring every Jewish person back to the land. Mark uses a different historical background, Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 4, based upon that passage in Mark 13:27, where Moses said they'll be regathered from the four corners of the earth and the four corners of heaven. That's what Mark is saying. They'll be regathered from the outermost parts of the earth, living Israel, and the outermost parts of heaven, resurrected Israel. Because the Jewish people that will survive this period of judgment, we call the tribulation, will enter the kingdom in their natural state. Also be the resurrection of all of the Old Testament saints. And so Israel will be dwelt with the living Israel, but also resurrected Israel. And so Matthew chapter 8 says that people who come from the north, south, east, and west, they will sup, they will fellowship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They'll be living in the land. Okay, the third aspect is the possession of the land based upon the Abrahamic covenant. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3, when God called Abraham, he simply promised him he'll be shown a land. Nothing more than that is promised. When you get to Genesis chapter 12, verse 7, he extends the promise that Abraham's seed, Abraham's descendants, will someday own the land, possess the land. When Genesis 13, verses 14 through 17, he extends the promise even further. The land would be possessed not only by the seed of Abram, by Abram himself. He says, to you and to your seed, I will give this land. And since Abraham's seed is to possess the land, the population will be greatly increased, and Abram is told to work the length of the land, the breadth of the land, symbolically claiming ownership, because someday he really will own the promised land. And those who simply say the promise was not to be taken literally, only God promised him a land, he was talking about heaven, symbolizing heaven. That renders many verses totally inadequate. What's God asking Abraham to do in verse 17? Is he saying, come up to heaven, spend some days with me and see if you like the place? Someday I'll give it to you? This only makes sense if it's a real piece of real estate. And with the borders of the land, walk the breadth, and symbolically claim ownership. In the future, you will have ownership. Genesis 15, verses 12 to 21, he provides the borders of the land as far as north-south, Euphrates in the north, the river Egypt in the south. And the east later will be told to be the Jordan River. The west is obvious, the Mediterranean Sea. And this is also a chapter that he signs and seals the covenant. There are different kinds of covenants in those days. For example, there was a hand covenant, there was a shoe covenant, there was a salt covenant, but the most solemn kind of covenant was a blood covenant. And when two men decide to make a blood covenant, they will kill one or more animals by shedding blood, divide the animal in half, and walk together between the pieces of the animals. And what they were saying is, may my blood be shed like this animal blood was shed if I don't keep the terms of the covenant. With the both of them walking together, this was a conditional covenant. And if one broke the promises or the content, he would be executed. That freed the other one from having to fulfill any obligations. Now, the point of similarity is God tells Abram to kill several animals by shedding blood, divide the bodies in half. But it won't be God and Abram that walk between the pieces of the animals. He puts Abram into a deep sleep. But it is a visionary sleep because he's conscious of what's happening around him. And then God takes on visible form out of a flaming torch in a burning furnace, what we call the Shekinah, the Shekinah glory. God alone walks between the pieces of the animals. And by walking alone, that renders the covenant unconditional. And what that means is that no matter how often Abram fails, he will fail in the very next chapter, chapter 16. And no matter how often his descendants fail, and we have failed him much more frequently, it cannot render the covenant null and void. The covenant will stand, and every promise must be fulfilled to whom the promise was made. Amen. Next. Now Abraham had a total of 8 sons, and God did not confirm the covenant through all 8 sons, only through one son, and that would be Isaac in Genesis 26, verses 2 through 5. And he promises to Isaac, to you and to your seed I will give this land. Not only to the seed, but to Isaac personally. Next, Isaac had 2 sons, and God did not choose to confirm the covenant through both sons, only through, next slide. And God did not choose to confirm the covenant through both sons, only one son, and that is Jacob. He also makes the same promise to Jacob, to you and to your seed I will give this land. And so all 3 patriarchs received the promise. Jacob had 12 sons, and God did confirm the covenant through all 12 sons, and so they numbered the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, next. For some prophetic development, Leviticus 26, verses 40 through 45, promises a regeneration of Israel in verse 40 and 41, and then only when they become a nationally saved nation in verse 42 will they receive all of the promises, all of the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant, which includes the restoration to all of the promised land. Next. Deuteronomy 30 verse 5 reaffirms, this is the land covenant reaffirming that promise. Next. Isaiah 27 verse 12, all of the promised land will be possessed. Isaiah 30 verses 23 to 26, there'll be increased productivity. Isaiah 35 verse 1 and 2, the deserts will blossom. Isaiah 65 verses 21 to 24, there'll be productivity in the land and security in the land. Next. Jeremiah 31, God's everlasting love for Israel in verses 1 through 3. God will restore and build them again. There'll be a time of plenty, and they'll come to Jerusalem for the worship, for the purpose of worshiping the Lord. In verse 11 through 14 of Jeremiah 31, in verse 11 he promises a redemption of Israel, resulting in the land being productive and joy in the land, and never any sadness because of a lack of rain, the drought, the things of that nature. Next. Ezekiel 20 verses 42 through 44, the regathering will be based upon the Abrahamic covenant. Israel will turn away from her sins and will serve the one true living God. Next, Ezekiel 28, 25, and 26, they'll possess all of the promised land and they'll also have security in the land. Next. Ezekiel 34, verses 25 to 31, there'll be security in verse 25. Rains will come properly, meaning the early rains will come when they're supposed to, the main body when they're supposed to, latter rain when they're supposed to. There'll be increased productivity. There'll be security from animals with no destruction of the crops. Israel will be God's private possession. Ezekiel 36, verses 8 through 15, the land will be tilled. inhabitants will be increased, there'll be the possession of the land, and the productivity will be tremendous. Israel possessed the land in verse 28. Again, the possession will be a result of regeneration in verse 29. The reproach of Israel will be removed. Israel will detest her past sins, but it will not be for Israel's glory. It will be for the glory of the God of Israel. Verse 33, the regeneration, possession of the land again, the rebuilding of the land may be for God's glory, and the population will be increased, that the places rebuilt. God will be jealous for his land, bring about great productivity. This is Joel 2, security from further invasions, produced abundantly. Next. A lot of these promises are just repetitious. Next. Joel 3:18, there'll be abundance of water. Amos 9:13, increased productivity of the land. I want to look at this passage a bit. Matthew 22, verses 22 through 33. It's a section in the Gospels where you have a discussion between Yeshua and the Sadducees. And as most of you already know, there are certain differences between Pharisaic Judaism and Sadducean Judaism. One of these was on the issue of the resurrection. The Pharisees firmly believed with the coming of the Messiah there'd be a resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees did not believe in any resurrection. That's why they were sad, you see. And they like to ask Pharisees trick questions to make them look stupid and often succeed, and they throw in the trick questions on Yeshua in this passage. They come to him and say, we know you're a great teacher. We have a theological problem, maybe you can solve it for us. Here's our problem. There was a couple that had 7 sons. The oldest son marries this one woman, but he dies with no children. So in keeping with the Torah, the next brother marries her, he also dies with no children. So again, in keeping with the Torah, the third brother marries her, he also dies with no kids. In the course of time, all 7 were married to this one woman. All died with no kids. After a while, she also passed away. Now in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? Because all 7 had been married to her, and none of them had any children. Now, just between you and me, if the Sadducees had come to me with that question, my answer would have been a bit different than one Yeshua chose to give. In my case, I would call for a grand jury investigation to find out why are these guys dying off so soon after they married this one woman. But he chose to ignore that problem, that issue. Notice what he does not do. He does not quote the 3 classic passages we have in the Hebrew Bible that teaches resurrection. He doesn't quote Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. He doesn't quote Isaiah 26:19. He doesn't quote Job 19, verse 25 and 26. 3 passages that clearly teach resurrection, he does not quote. There's a reason for this. The Pharisees believed you can derive doctrine from any part of the Hebrew Bible, be it the Torah, the Nevi'im, prophets, or the Ketuvim, the writings. But the Sadducees said, no, you cannot do that. Every doctrine must have its origin in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. If it's in the Torah, then you can use the prophets and writings to illustrate the doctrine, but the origin must come from the 5 books of Moses. They saw no evidence of resurrection in the Torah and therefore chose not to believe it. So quoting Daniel or Job or Isaiah would have been authoritative for the Pharisees, but not authoritative for the Sadducees. So what he does in verse 32, notice, he quotes the 2nd book of Moses, Exodus chapter 6, verse 3, where God says to Moses, I'm the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And that was the formula for the Abrahamic covenant. We've simplified our terms today. We simply say Abrahamic covenant, but in the scriptures it's a sentence. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. But where in the Torah does God promise a resurrection? It's found in a very simple principle. If God makes a promise to an individual, but that individual dies before the promise is fulfilled, that obligates God to raise him back to life. Because again, every promise must be fulfilled and must be fulfilled when the promise was made. And that was the principle in the mind of Abraham when he was asked to sacrifice Isaac. Why was he ready to plunge the knife into Isaac's throat? Because by that then he knew that the God he follows was a promise-keeping God. And he knew if he had to kill Isaac, God would have to raise him back to life. How did he know that? Not because God said it would happen, But he knew that this God has to raise Isaac back to life because already promises were made about Isaac, not yet fulfilled. So contained in the unfulfilled promises is the promise of the resurrection. And so, as I mentioned, Matthew 8 says, in the kingdom they'll come from north, south, east, and west to sup with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They'll be resurrected, living in the land and also possessing the promised land. And so that's where you can find the resurrection in the Torah. Unfulfilled promises made to people remained unfulfilled. When the patriarchs died, what did they own of the land? One cave for burying relatives, which they had to pay a lot of money for. One plot of land near Shechem they had to pay good money for, and some wells they had to fight for. So how's God going to keep these promises when he said, to you and to your seed I will give this land? They must be resurrected. And so that's the principle of unfulfilled promises. Okay, next I'm going to have to just quickly go through this. It's already out of time. Just about now I begin to feel like an Egyptian mummy, pressed for time. I didn't say Egyptian mother, I said Egyptian mummy. If we establish the Davidic throne, that's based upon the Davidic covenant that promised that he will sit upon the throne of David, ruling over saved Israel. And this requires a future Messianic kingdom. There'll be other verses that promote this. Next. You have Samuel and Chronicles. The difference between the two passages, that Samuel focuses on David's immediate son, Solomon. Chronicles focuses on David's distant son, the Messiah. And so they seem very parallel, but there's some key differences that you can tell he's talking about something different. Next. Basically we can summarize it this way. God promised David 4 eternal things: the eternal house or dynasty, eternal throne, eternal kingdom, and an eternal possession. And the eternality of the first three, the throne, house, and kingdom, is guaranteed because the seed of David culminates in one who is himself eternal, the Messianic God-man. And this Messianic God-man is the one to sit upon the throne of David, ruling over saved Israel and the Gentiles. Okay, I'm not going to go to the prophetic development because my time is up. But let me just go to the very last segment. Go ahead, continue. Next. Keep going. Next. Okay. Here in Ezekiel 37, verses 21 to 28, you have all four facets intertwining themselves. So verse 21, they'll be regathered. Verse 22, they'll be restored from the land. Verse 23, they'll be regenerated. Verse 24, David the king will be the shepherd. Also in verse 24, they're empowered to walk and observe the law of God. Verse 25, they shall occupy the land and David will be the shepherd. Verse 26, the new covenant will be applied to Israel. And in verse 26 and 27, God's tabernacle will be with them. And in verse 28, nations will know that Israel is God's people. And so these are the promises yet to be fulfilled. And I'll only give you a small sampling of what the Bible teaches. And therefore, this is why we cannot just ignore it. Let's summarize this in 5 basic statements. Number 1, God, who in judgment scattered the Jews, will regather them as well. Secondly, the Jews will be gathered into their own land, and this will cause God's name to be sanctified among the Gentiles. Thirdly, the people will be regenerated. Fourthly, the Jews will never again be forced out of the land. And fifthly, there will be the people of God both covenantally and experientially. Selah. Just a couple of announcements. Upstairs, as you go up for the Onek, you'll find a book of table. There are copies of various writings and so on. But the newer book, I finally completed 40 years of research. It's the life of the Messiah from Messianic Jewish perspective. The white covers is the long version. It covers, it's 4 volumes long. It covers all the rabbinic backgrounds and so on in the first century Judaism, first century Israel. And this gives you the complete account and all of the Jewish backgrounds for many of the things, why things are said the way they're said, why things happen the way they happen, and so on. For people that are not particularly interested in all of the details, all of the sources, We put together also one volume of Bishtar version that only focuses on the wording of the Gospels and the Jewish backgrounds, but doesn't give you my sources and so on. That's in the white cover. So these books will be available upstairs, and also available upstairs will be the manuscript. This manuscript is what we just covered. If you want the manuscript version of this, and this gives you much more detail than I was able to give you here. It'll be available upstairs. Also part of our teaching program, we have a Messianic Bible School program every summer in upstate New York, in the Adirondacks. And it's a 6-week program. There's a 2-week curriculum, a 3-week curriculum, and that follows a 5-year cycle. You have to come for 5 summers to get everything we offer and receive a certificate of completion. But the 6th week is the one course we teach every year, which is the life of the Messiah from the Messianic Jewish perspective. And so we covered that, the 25 version of that course, all in 1 week every year, 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours at night. And at the table you'll find information sheets about this summer's program, who's teaching what courses and things of that nature. You can come for 1 week, you can also come for all 6 weeks and have a real immersion of Messianic Jewish studies. And we also publish a magazine of Bible studies from the Messianic Jewish perspective called the Ariel magazine. Comes out 4 times a year. And I believe I put it here somewhere. Can't find it now. But you'll find the blue brochure on the table up there, which gives you a basic introduction ministry. There's a coupon page there. We offer this magazine free of charge. We don't charge for the magazine. So if you want to receive it, you can receive it in 2 copies. If you want a hard copy, then give us your full name and address so we can send it to you by mail. It's also available as an email. If you want an email copy, just give us your email address and that'll be sufficient. And every magazine has between 3 up to 5 different studies from this Messianic Jewish perspective.